Hey everyone, hello, how are you? I hope everybody's in good form and nobody's feeling lonely or sad because of the darkness of this time of year, because it is an opportunity, as everyone has been saying, to rest and recuperate. So I was feeling very kind of stuck a couple of weeks ago, but I've got my energy back and I'm feeling lively again. And so I'm out today to bring you a very harrowing true story. Because when we look back to the past, we can see that the present is mirroring the past. And what does that mean? And why is it important? So unfortunately, history is missing from the school curriculum. I mean, it's still there, but barely. And people don't understand that we have to learn from the past. We need to learn lessons that sent us into shock in the past. And this story is a harrowing true story about the past here in Ireland and what happened. And the reason I'm telling you it is because I feel really strongly how important it is to be self-reliant, to be resilient, to be able to look after yourself, to look after your own health, to feed yourself, all those things that will make you an independent and sovereign being. When we look back to the past, we can see why it is still so important to be vigilant and to do those things. So today we're out and about. We're just over the border into County Mayo and we're in a little town called Louisburg. And 175 years ago, during the time known as the Irish Famine, it wasn't actually a famine at all, but we'll get into that as the video goes on. At that time, in the late 1840s, people's potato crops suffered with terrible blight, and a lot of them began to starve because that was the only food they had. So the period known as the Great Hunger, we'll say. I don't like to call it a famine because it wasn't a famine. We'll call it the Great Hunger for now. What happened in Louisburg was that, like everywhere else, people were looking for relief because they were starving. And the people of Louisburg and the surrounding environs were told that some guardians were coming, the poor law guardians were coming to assess their needs and work out if they were eligible for relief, which might be a bowl of soup, it might be a job building a road to nowhere, it might be a wall that was purposeless. Whatever it was, those people wanted to get that relief. So they all came into Louisburg town to meet the poor law guardians. And then, to their surprise, they were told that the poor law guardians had gone 12 miles up the road to Delphi Lodge, which was a hunting lodge belonging to the Marquess of Sligo. So the people thought, well, we'd best go to the Delphi Lodge to meet these poor law guardians and hopefully they will give us some relief. So men, women and children, the elderly, the disabled, people who were literally on their knees had to go because you couldn't claim for somebody else. You had to go in person. And so they'd walked this 12-mile road in March when it was bitterly cold with hail and sleet and rain, and they arrived at Delphi Lodge. So the people of Louisburg and the surrounding villages set off towards Delphi Lodge along this same road, which wasn't tarmac then, it would have been a rough track. And as you can see, the valley is bleak, it's desolate, it's cold. I'm feeling the cold and I have multiple layers on. And those poor people were in rags. They were vulnerable because they were half starved. Some of them were, as I say, crippled, unable to make the 12 miles, but they were determined to do so to get some relief. And it's just heartbreaking to think. Living, walking skeletons heading that way. And I think it's important we walk in their footsteps, that we remember how important it is to be self-reliant. Ooh. Hey. There are a number of commemorative rocks and crosses on the route, and this is one of them. And you might be thinking to yourself, why did people walk 12 miles when they were so hungry, when they were so cold, when they had, they could have stayed at home? But the point is, there was no social welfare in those days. The only thing that you could get would be called poor relief, and it was means tested. You were assessed as to your eligibility and whether or not you deserved relief. So you had to be very deserving as well. So the potato blight first hit in 1845, and this walk occurred in 1849. So you might be wondering, why did people still keep growing potatoes when they were so affected by blight, which led to them having no food? Because the point is, there was tons and tons and thousands of tons of food in the country, leaving every single day. But the ordinary Irish people were not able to access it. They could only access what they'd grown themselves, and they'd been growing potatoes because potatoes were such a productive crop. You needed very little to get a large harvest, and they didn't have room to expand and grow anything else. So they were forced into growing potatoes, even though they were growing food for their landlords. So they were busy working, growing oats and oatmeal, growing wheat, growing barley, raising beef and pork and bacon and ham and chickens and eggs. All of that food left. Thousands and thousands and thousands of tons left the country every day. And I did have a list, but it's blown away in the wind. But believe me, there would be literally hundreds and thousands of tons of food arriving at the English ports every day. And we know that because the Times of London reported all the ships that came into the harbours. And on top of that, the British government had deployed over half the whole of the British Army. 67 regiments were deployed to Ireland to guard the food as it made its way to the ports, to the ships to be taken to England. And you might think, well, why did England need so much of the food from Ireland? And it was simply because a century previously, they'd moved their own people off the land with the Act of Enclosure. They'd forced them into the towns and cities to work in all the factories and the mills for the great wheel of progress known as the industrial age. And so there weren't enough people growing food in England at that time. And there just wasn't enough to feed all the workers. And so our food from Ireland was sent there to feed that wheel of capitalism, I suppose. So if you were a small tenant farmer in Ireland at the time, you were paying rent. You had to pay the rent, otherwise you would be evicted and your house toppled down. If you did anything at all to improve your house, if you put a lick of whitewash on it, if you planted a flower garden, if you did anything at all, the landlord would put up the rent. So basically people were stuck, they were constricted, they were trapped into simply growing the potatoes, because generally they could harvest enough to keep them going for about 9 months of the year. And here is another commemorative cross which says, erected to the memory of those who died in the famine of 1845 to 1849. But of course, it wasn't a famine with so much food in the country. It was a deliberate starvation. Some people today would call it a genocide. And in fact, if you go and research the British parliamentary papers and various communications that were made at the time, even the English referred to it as a holocaust in those writings. And I'd just like to mention as well that when you think of a starvation, when people are dying because of lack of food, they don't just die of hunger. There are all kinds of other crippling illnesses that affect them. So, for example, many people developed typhus and cholera because, you know, if you're freezing cold, you tend to huddle together. Disease was spread easily, spread like wildfire. Because people were starving, they were much more vulnerable to other illnesses that normally they may have thrown off without any bother. And one of the things that they received for relief was Indian cornmeal, which was maize from America. But you know what corn is like? It's very hard. Nobody really knew what to do with it. They didn't know how to cook it. Nobody told them what to do with it. And so because they were starving and desperate to eat something, they wouldn't cook it for long enough. And therefore, it tended to rip their guts apart. It caused such havoc internally that they ended up with crippling gut issues, and some people died from gangrene of the bowel. I mean, it's unimaginable. I don't even want to go to those places where you could actually imagine what it would be like to die in that kind of agony. But you see, we're told that 2 million people died, which is nonsense, because between the north of Ireland and the southern part of Ireland, the Republic, there were about 9 million people at that time. And by the end of this period, there was about 3.5 to 4 million. So how come we're told that 2 million people died or emigrated? And that is because one man who was working for the census, for all the statistics to do with the census returns, he was a medical commissioner. He was called William Whyte, and he fabricated the statistics. He manipulated the statistics and really only recorded those who literally died of hunger as having died from starvation. The people who died from typhus and cholera were not included in the count of those who died in this man-made famine. So, and of course he was knighted for his actions, as was the man in charge of all the regiments, the 67 regiments that protected the food leaving Ireland. He received a knighthood as well, and the Order of the Bath. So that was a very high privileged recognition for his actions as well. So now, finally, 12 miles from Louisburg, I've arrived at the Delphi Lodge which was a hunting lodge for the Marquess of Sligo in those days, and now it's a lovely country hotel. So the people got here. Approximately 600 people travelled that day, and when they arrived here to speak with the poor law guardians and hopefully get some relief, and when they arrived here they were told that the poor law guardians were too busy to see them, they were having their lunch, and best to come back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. So the people had a terrible dilemma. They'd made all that effort when they're so vulnerable and weak and cold and hungry. They'd made that effort to get here and they were told to go away. So what should they do? Should they go back to Louisburg, 12 miles, and then come back again at 7 a.m? Or should they stay here overnight and just sit out in the elements? So after that day, many people died, and some of them were buried along the route that we've just travelled. Others would have died shortly afterwards when they got home. I don't know whether they got any relief at all. But that walk is very significant and very typical of what happened in many other places in Ireland as well. This is a national monument commissioned by the government to represent all of those people who emigrated during those terrible years of the Great Hunger, the genocide. And so when we think of the millions who died or disappeared in that time, many of them emigrated to America, to Canada, to England, to Australia. And many of you viewers are descended from those people. And this is the most amazing sculpture because, as you can see, the rigging, it's all skeletal remains of the people because so many people died on those transatlantic crossings that the ships became known as coffin ships. The people were thrown overboard because they had a burial at sea, and it's just the most amazing monument to commemorate them, and it's by John Behan, I believe. It's it's very emotional to see it, to see this representation of those who died in such a stark form. But I think the best thing we can do for ourselves is to remember to be resilient, to be self-reliant, to be independent, to not bow to authorities, to not comply when we know in our guts that something might be bad for us, definitely not good for us. And I think one of the ways we can do that is to build community of like-minded people. So if there's anybody in your neighbourhood that you know feels similar, get together, start growing food together. Just start planning that you're there for each other even. And don't do it from a place of fear, do it from a new beginning, a new way of being, to make sure that the past does not mirror, or rather that our future, our present and future does not mirror the past. So that's a bit of a sad note to end on, but hopefully it's an encouraging note as well that we're all autonomous, sovereign beings, and we need to pull together and resist any forces that are going to lead to this kind of catastrophe ever again. So I hope that when you're tucking into your Christmas dinner, you can remember all this from a good place rather than a fearful place, and to think these people didn't die in, their deaths weren't pointless, because when we look at the past, we can learn and avoid those same mistakes. So wishing you all the best, and I'll see you next week when we're celebrating the winter solstice, when the light returns and it's a time for joyfulness and celebration. So bye for now.